Good morning, everyone. This is both a privilege and an honor to welcome Professor Peter van den Bossche to NALSAR University of Law. Professor Bossche, a towering figure in the realm of international trade law, revered globally for his contribution to this complex and ever-evolving field. It would not be an exaggeration to say that among this audience, he does not need any introduction because, as all of you are interested in the field of international trade law, perhaps Professor Peter, the adjudicator, has served as the chair and member of appellate body of the dispute settlement body of World Trade Organization. And during his tenure, he has shaped significant jurisprudence in global trade governance. I think his last case was that of US Boy. Professor Peter, the academician, has also imparted profound knowledge as a professor and a leader at premier institutions worldwide, including his position as a director of studies of the World Trade Institute. He has penned definitive works on WTO law and policy that are indispensable to scholars and practitioners alike. His works are prescribed textbooks here at NALSAR University of Law for Kapil's course on international trade law. Today, we are really fortunate to host him in person. He has earlier participated virtually in our DSU conference last April. It is with deep appreciation that we welcome someone of his caliber who overcame many hurdles, including navigating the complex visa process, to be with us here. My dear students, please join me in welcoming the stalwart of international economic law. Let me invite Professor Peter to the stage.
Thank you very, very much, madam, for this most kind introduction, too kind introduction, if I may say so, but thank you. Good morning. This is a difference between an Indian classroom and an American classroom. In an American classroom, the professor says, good morning. You get good morning as a response. Good morning.
Good morning.
Fast learners. Right. It's a privilege and a pleasure for me to be here. And to talk today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, and Thursday on WTO law and the climate crisis. This is a course, as the subtitle informs you. This is a course on green electricity, solar cells. India knows a lot about the links between the two, as we will discuss tomorrow. Palm oil, electrical vehicles, carbon emissions, and an existential threat to humankind. And I don't say this easily. An existential threat to humankind. That is what the climate crisis is. Now, what will we do in the 4 days that I will be with you? We will talk today, this morning, we will talk about that climate crisis and its link to international trade. And then this afternoon, we will talk about international trade again, its link with the WTO and trade-related climate measures. It are these trade-related climate measures that will be the subject of our case analysis. On Tuesday, tomorrow. And we look at Canada renewable energy. We will look at India solar cells. We will look at EU palm oil and United States IRA. Actually, we'll probably look at that one on Wednesday, together with something that is not yet subject to dispute settlement, but take my word for it, will be subject to dispute settlement, the EU CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And then finally, on Thursday, we will try to come to some sort of solution and looking forward. And we'll talk about constructive unilateralism. What am I referring to? Well, I'm basically referring to all the above, the cases. I'm referring to the United States Inflation Reduction Act. Those of you who might be slightly surprised now, Reduction Inflation Act. What is this? It is the United States' biggest effort to address the climate crisis so far. CBAM, same thing. So I think these are unilateral measures to address the climate crisis. They may be misguided, they may be mistaken, but they are efforts to address the climate crisis. But they're unilateral. Perhaps they're constructive, perhaps they're not. But clearly, multilateral cooperation, the better thing, is feasible. Collective action will obviously be the best. Okay, but that's for the last day, and you see that there is a question mark after that title. Today, we'll talk about the climate crisis and international trade. And we'll start by saying a few things about the climate crisis, but let me give you an agenda of what we will address. There are sort of questions that I hope that after this lecture, you have an answer to, or at least the beginning of an answer. First of all, what is the state of the global climate today? How bad is it? Secondly, what are the consequences of a failure to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? And I'm sure you all already heard of that sort of target limit, 1.5%, 1.5 degrees Celsius. Come back to that later. But what are the consequences of failing to meet that limit? What are the efforts that are currently already being undertaken by countries? Because there are many efforts being undertaken, collectively and individually. And are there, because when I talk about these efforts being undertaken, many of you will immediately say, oh, yes, of course, there's the Paris Agreement, 2015. But is there more, certainly in terms of international law obligations, that would require us, nations of the world, would require us to address the climate crisis? And there are very, very interesting developments going on for lawyers. Very interesting developments going on at this very moment. And then we're turning to trade. After all, I'm not here to talk about the climate crisis as such. I'm not the right person. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a lawyer. So is international trade responsible for this sorry state of the climate? First question. But another question is, stay away here. A good place for the mic. Another question is, does climate change adversely affect international trade? So I'm going to look at it in both directions. Trade, climate change, trade. We will also talk about then international trade help countries to overcome challenges of climate crisis. And then finally, we'll look into the possibility of cooperation. international trade cooperation in responding to the climate crisis. Now, that's a long list of things, so let's get started. Promise you a short break. The professor said 10 minutes. Too soft on you. I'm sure he is not. But you'll get 5 minutes. But you will get a 5 minutes break around the hour. So some of you may now already be looking forward to that. Where are we today? Well, global average temperature has been rising and rising and rising. 2024, and the data are not final yet. And this is a sort of forecast, but it's a pretty definitive forecast. In 2024, global average temperatures were 1.54 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. Take that as a given at the moment, huh? Because is that a lot? Is that not a lot? I mean, the industrial levels. What period are we referring to when we say pre-industrial? We're referring to the first part of the 19th century. Because the industrial era is supposed to have started. It's a bit arbitrary, but for these things we say that the industrial era started in 1850. 1850 is 0. It's as from there that we start counting for this increase. Now, if we look at other years, and all of a sudden it becomes clear that last year was the warmest year on the record. It has never been warmer. And compared with 2023, temperatures were 1.45 degrees Celsius above that pre-industrial level. And in 2022, 1.15. I don't have to make my point anymore as to that it's rising. And it's rising rapidly. 2025 is expected to be even warmer. Now, one should always, certainly when you read things in the media, journalists have a tendency to exaggerate things, and one should not really look too much to 1 year. You should take it over a 10-year period, because even, I mean, nature itself, temperatures do go up and down, and there are all sorts of natural phenomena that explain, and there's the Niño and the Niña. So we're looking at a 10-year average, and now we're looking at the average 2014 to 2023. On that calculation, global average temperatures were 1.21 degrees Celsius above pre-historical, not prehistorical, pre-industrial levels. So, but in that year, 2023, the Secretary General of the United Nations made the following statement. And I could not resist sharing this with you. He said, the era of global warming has ended. And all of us said, well, which world does he live? But there's a comma, the era of global boiling has arrived. It's a very, very serious person, UN Secretary General. Everything he says is being very carefully monitored and thought of about, because this has impact on what people do and do not do. So perhaps my course should have been a course on global boiling rather than global warming and WTO law. Now, where do we see this? Yeah? Because these are numbers. Where do we see this? Where do we see evidence of this global warming or this climate crisis? So I have people that say global warming. Well, it was cold this summer. Yeah, it was not. Yeah, and there was a lot of snow. So where's the? All right. Sea levels. Sea levels. 2023 record high. Over the last 20 years, sea levels have risen by 11 centimeters. And over since 1880, 24 centimeters. I say, well, they say a big deal. I come from Belgium. Belgium is next to the Netherlands. And both parts of Belgium and most of the Netherlands are below sea level. Right? So they only exist because of dikes. Dikes are constructed to take care of. So by the end of this century, if we have similar increase in the level of seawater, sea levels increase similarly, we will either have to construct higher dikes, much higher dikes, or lose land. Now, there's an area here, and perhaps also part of India. I didn't do my homework on that, but Bangladesh, for example, it's very, very. And there are, of course, island states that are already now in the process of evacuating people from, because they're flooded. They'll be flooded. Another another thing where you can see that this climate crisis is in glacier mass and in the South Pole sea ice loss. Glacier mass. I'm now living in Germany, but until a couple of months ago, I was living in Switzerland. And from time to time, academic work permitting, went into the mountains and I saw the glaciers. In 2021, 2022, glaciers lost 6% of their mass in 1 year. Since 2001, that may, for some of you, may be a long time ago. Not for me. It's the advantage or disadvantage of getting old. So 2001, I can still very well remember what I was doing then. Since 2001, glacier mass has declined with 33%. And you actually see that if you go in Switzerland into the mountains to a glacier, then they will point out, no, the glacier used to be, come over there, now it's up there. Gone. Warming, global warming. Sea levels, sorry, no, extent of the South Pole icy in winter. Same story, extreme low levels in 2023 and 2024. What we also see is the reoccurrence of the occurrence of a more frequent occurrence of extreme weather conditions. Heat waves, droughts, wildfires. You've been watching the news lately? These things happen, of course, but if they happen year after year after year, and not only there, but also in other countries, you start asking questions, no? And yet, they just elected the president that is a climate crisis denier. The climate crisis, no. The climate change, no. That's just a hoax. to undermine the American economic power. Back to that later. Flooding and heavy rains, cyclones and severe storms. That's what we see on a day-to-day basis. This is just for your own study. By the way, these slides are being made available. So, 1850. Now, a few more words about global warming and then about its causes. On global warming, well, forecasts at the current warming rate, and again, now we're talking about this 10-year average. At the current rate, by the early 2030s, the temperature will be more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's almost a certainty at the current rate. And the impact is already currently felt globally. Although, and that's very important to make, with significant regional differences. There are countries, there are regions in the world that suffer much, much more than others. And there are scientists that say that action is not taken to really dramatically reduce global warming in 2030, and that's not that far off anymore. 2030, we will have reached the tipping point of no return, a point at which global warming becomes irreversible and actually starts accumulating on its own. So what are the principal causes? Well, the principal causes are greenhouse gas emissions. And when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we think in the first place, and correctly so, we think about carbon emissions. 76% of greenhouse gas emissions are carbon emissions. But they're not the only ones, and I just want to make this point here. There are also methane emissions. And we all know who the most important producers of methane are. Cattle and what other animals, live animals that we keep for meat production. I'm vegetarian. I'll try to convince you later. So 16% is actually not related to carbon, but to methane. And as you can see, there's still some other kinds of emissions too. What are the main sources then of these greenhouse gases? And we could play the game, and you could start guessing, but I'm sure that you would come up with this list, if only because it's already indicated in the last picture. By the way, the pictures are there not just because it gives color to the screen. They each try to tell a story. Okay? So when you study this and study on the basis of the slides, you might want to try to make a link between the. Sometimes it's easier to remember some of the things that I have been saying and that you're supposed to know by looking at the pictures. Anyway, main sources, transportation, yes, and that will be an important thing when we then later on look at whether trade is responsible for climate change. Transportation, yes, big deal. Transportation also includes, of course, the mere fact that we were driving a car from the resort here. And so also local transport. Also, it's not necessarily trade. Industry, yes. Electricity generation, yes. Agriculture, and then a category that they call residential, but I consider that air conditioning and heating. I assume you don't need very often here, but that's all in this residential category. Who are the main polluters? Anybody cares to make a guess? Any guesses? Who are the main polluters? Who are the baddies here? Excuse me?
She means developed countries.
Well, developed or developing? I would say, historically speaking, definitely right. And we'll come back to that when we talk about the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Yeah? Because it's not India that has caused the trouble we're currently in, obviously. Yeah? Either is it China, either is it any part of the developing world. Developed world has been polluting since 1850. Thank you, but no. China. China is currently, you were going to hold here.
Not because the developing countries, the way the world trade is working right now, they are producing like the majority of the industrial activity, which are responsible for the carbon emissions and all the things that is contributing to the climate crisis. They are outsourcing all these activities to the developing countries. This is the primary reason why US is not largely single largest contributor to directly for the climate issues, but it is because the large amount of the consumption it is used. I think you can continue now. Sorry.
No, very, very good point. And I'm glad you make it that early in the course because this is a very important point. Yeah. So hold on next to it, and we'll come back to it. But main polluters, and in this order, at this moment, there's China, the United States, India, European Union, Russia, and Brazil. Now, of course, this is the pollution by these countries, but the population of these countries differs enormously. So if you would sort of bring this back for pollution per capita, per person, then the ranking would be different. Yeah? And would be different. And that's even apart from the reasons why. And then yet another thing, I'll say it now, but I'll repeat it later. Everybody has a right to development. Yeah. I mean, developed world now say, oh, wait a minute, we're developed. You're still trying to develop, but no, you can't do that anymore because we have a problem. Okay, we'll come back to that. So these are the main polluters. But there is the following that I need to say in this context. In 2022, I don't have more recent data. In 2022, compared to 2021, China, the US, and India increased their emissions. Now, I would say for China and India, again, that is not something illogical because they're still very much on a development trajectory. But India has increased it by 5%. But they still increased. The European Union, on the other hand, has lowered its emission by 0.8% in 2022. And if you look back, the European Union used to be a very bad polluter. But since 1990, they have reduced their emissions with 27%.
Also, I think they outsource their emissions.
You make the same point, and I agree. You make the same point. Yes, but they shouldn't really take credit for this. Concentration levels in 2023 are at, so the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere is at record level. How many times did I now already say that something is at record level? Repeatedly. is at regular, and further increase is expected. Now, again, that I'll leave for your own study. This is a graph with a table with many interesting data. Now, what are the consequences of not acting, of just ignoring the climate crisis? Well, there's a very interesting report, which I think is part of your reading materials. It was added in digital form. Perhaps also printed out. On the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's a UN panel of scientists. And they wrote a report in 2019 on the impact of global warming beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what they predicted, and to some extent already saw happening at that moment, but what we've seen happening more and more since, are heat waves and desertification, heavy rainfalls and flooding, land loss as a result of rising sea levels, wildfires, the shifting distribution of animal and plant species. It is now, in Europe we see that, you can now grow wine in the north of Netherlands. The north of the Netherlands, the temperatures were such that that was completely, well, yes, you could have grapes, but they always remained like frustratingly small. Now, so you can have wine production much higher north in Europe than you used to. We're talking about agriculture, sustainable agriculture in Iceland. So there's a shift in that way, and also an extinction. That was the prediction of the report. An extinction of 1 million species. Most of them are small insects and small birds, and so you may not immediately notice it, but species is of course also animal and plant. We see a decrease in crop yields, partly because there's either too heavy rain or not enough rain. The climate changes, temperatures are not what they should be for an optimal crop. And that, of course, increases food insecurity and leads to poverty, often extreme poverty. So, I don't know whether you're still with me, but I would say that global warming and climate change is an urgent and potentially irreversible threat to human society and the planet, and it needs to be addressed. Okay, has it been addressed? What have the efforts been to date to address the climate crisis? Well, this may come as a surprise to you. And when I first looked a few years ago, when I first looked at this issue, I was actually surprised. Oh, well, they're already thinking about this for a long time. It's the first time that we had something happening in this field was in 1992. 1992, there was the first environmental treaty. It was not the first environmental treaty, but it was the first environmental treaty to combat what was called, and it's a quote, dangerous human interference with the climate system, end of quote. And that convention was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was signed at what was later, no, actually already at the time, called the Earth Summit in New York. And it entered into force 2 years later, 1994. Now, what does it do? And It's actually very unambitious. Yeah. But it's important that it was there because it was the start of everything that we're dealing with now. But it encourages. Encourages. I always thought that was a nice word. It encourages, doesn't oblige, it encourages. It encourages industrialized countries, only developed countries, industrialized countries to stabilize their greenhouse gas emissions. Stabilize. Not talking about reducing, but talking about stabilization. The convention was ratified by 198 parties. That's about as much as you can get. That's global. Yeah? Including obviously India, but also including the European Union. I'm adding this because, of course, the European Union is a bit of an odd entity, not being a state, but being responsible for so many subject matters that deal with and that matter for climate change. And was probably the most important thing that was done by the convention. Certainly, if we look back to this from where we stand now, is that it set up, it created a framework for negotiations on the reduction of greenhouse gases. Because it was agreed that the conference of parties, that sort of all the parties together, and this is a body, it's an institution, it's an organ, they would come together year after year after year. And to discuss the progress that they were making. And then still very modest objective, to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions by industrialized countries. So, this is, by the way, where the word COP comes from, Conference of the Parties. I see many of you not with knowledge, but when I first, this must have been the COP3, by which I will say COP3. You know that in American slang, a cop is a police person, but COP3. So who was COP1 and who was COP2? The Conference of the Parties. Conference of the Parties. And they have been meeting year after year after year. And we just had COP29, and we will have COP30. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now, at COP3, I think the parties to the convention realized that they had to do more than what they did in decommission. And there you find a commitment by, again, only industrialized countries, 37 of them. Yeah? And if you're impressed by that number, start thinking that it was the member states of the European Union are all in that number 37. Yeah? So immediately you have already, then you had at that time many more. All right, so industrialized countries committed themselves to reduce in the period 2008-2012 to reduce their emissions by 5%. I find it interesting if you compare that with the reduction sort of goals, objectives that we're now talking about, and I will present them on the next slide. 5% is extremely modest. Extremely modest. But yeah, this was 1997. And it was a first step. The other thing that the Kyoto Convention Kyoto Protocol, Kyoto Protocol did was to assign levels of allowed emissions to countries. So yes, there was this reduction agreement, but at the same time they assigned levels of allowed emission. And that then also introduced the trading in emissions. So and you created a market, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that, and we'll come back to that when we talk about CBAM. So the introduction of emission trading and the creation of a carbon market. All that comes from the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol in one way is more important than the 1992 convention, because here we see the first real steps to setting up a system for the reduction, be it still very unambitious. That system of the Kyoto Protocol will be with what we will be working with until the Paris Agreement comes in. So up to 2016, we were working under that system of the Kyoto. The Kyoto Protocol has now been superseded by the Paris Agreement, and that's where we stand now. Paris Agreement negotiated and concluded, negotiated for many years, but concluded in Paris in 2015 at COP21. Ready? Let's see, from COP3 to 21, there was quite some evolution. It entered into force in 2016. It has 198 parties, of which 185 have now ratified, at least the last time I checked, because these numbers differ. But so again, this is a universal. There are very, very few entities, countries that are not covered here. Now, what does it do in the Paris Agreement? First of all, it imposes a limit on global warming. Or it expresses an objective. It says global warming should remain well below the language that was debated and debated, negotiated and negotiated. Every letter, every comma in this line was for a long time negotiated. And actually, I should have quoted it, not paraphrased it. But anyway, the idea is that global warming get well below 2 degrees Celsius, and preferably below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, this is interesting, yeah, because remember the study that we had on the previous slide? Study that says that if global warming goes above 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have all these terrible things happening to us, as we see. Perhaps this language reflects also a bit of realism, political realism. But at the same time, reflects a willingness on our side to accept some of the devastating effects of climate change, global warming. Therefore, we're not only talking anymore about how to prevent it, how to mitigate it, but how do we cope with the damage that is being created, the changes that are being created? How do we cope with that? Much of the discussion, of course, is now shifting also in that direction. Secondly, remember the 5% reduction that was in the Kyoto Protocol? Now we're talking about to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030. How are we today? 2025, 2030, that's 5 years off. Okay. This was, of course, much further off when it was agreed, 2015. Just giving you a reality check, 45% reduction. And what did I say about what the United States, India, and China did in 2022? They actually emitted more than they did the year before. Right? Okay. And to reach net zero by 2050, have carbon neutrality. Okay. Now, in order to have these reductions, the system that has been opted for is not to oblige countries to say, well, we're going to, and you're committed to reduce it to so much. No, they've chosen for countries making pledges of greenhouse emission reductions. And these pledges are called, and you will probably know this, nationally determined contributions. But the word itself doesn't have any word commitment, obligation. It's not in there, or concession, or no. It's nationally determined contributions, NDCs. They're non-binding. There's no enforcement mechanism for them. And it's more on a name and shame basis. Yeah? So if India sets for itself, it's nationally determined contribution, and they say X and they don't meet that X, they'll be named and shamed. Okay. Nobody wants to be named and shamed, but yeah, it's no. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this is not a good way of approaching it. I'm not suggesting that there's much of an alternative to this approach, but be realistic. This is a system without enforcement behind it, without legal obligation behind it. This is why what I will say later is perhaps not more important, is also important. When we talk about what the courts are doing, the international courts are doing. This should not come as a surprise now. Next slide. The current nationally determined contributions will not allow us to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius. They're not enough. Okay. Well below 2 degrees Celsius. Perhaps. Now, the other thing that the Paris Agreement does is to introduce the CBDR-RC principle. And that stands for the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. The idea behind it, and I think it's a brilliant idea, it's also an obvious thing, that we're all together into this. Yeah? There's only one world. And whoever made a mess, we're all now in that mess. So, and it is a common responsibility. But the responsibility to address it is differentiated. And it's differentiated because of two reasons. First, the historical one. And that historical one is, hey, listen, India is not responsible for much of the climate crisis that we witness currently. They have not been historically been major polluters. There is that. But there is also, and that's also why there's a differentiated responsibility of ability, capacity to address it. And in that, you have the idea that everybody has the right to develop and to bring its people up to a certain standard of living. I think it's a very important principle that has been now accepted. It's interpreted very, very differently by developed and developing countries. But it's there, and I'm sure it won't be anymore. Then, again, in the Paris Agreement, it also provides, and I've actually linked with the previous comment on CDR. There's assistance for developing countries to reduce greenhouse, in order to allow developing countries to reduce their emissions. And that's a point I will come back when I talk about the last COP. So financing for developing countries to address the climate crisis. Finally, well, there's more in the Paris Agreement, but my slide was full. So the last point is the regular reporting. The regular reporting on efforts, well, the regular reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, and how much do you emit, and your efforts to reduce them. So all parties to the Paris Agreement are under regular reporting obligations, which hopefully will give us data in order to decide on what next steps should be. Now, since 2016, we have the Paris Agreement. We've had a few COPs, Conference of the Parties, since. I'm only going to focus on the last two, of which the one in Dubai in December 23 was by far the more interesting and more promising. I was actually quite excited after that COP. First of all, they recognized, and this must not have been easy given the location of that COP, they recognized for the first time, the very first time, that there was a need to transition away from the use of fossil fuels. And they said that in Dubai. Now, the sad thing is that the next COP, they actually took one or two small steps back from that statement, from that intention to transit away from the use of fossil fuels, which obviously, if we want to reduce greenhouse gases, if we want to reduce carbon emissions, we will have to use other forms of energy than fossil fuels. What also happened in Dubai, it's also agreed upon, was to realizing that with the current nationally determined contributions, we would not get there where we want to get, to be more ambitious. And so countries were invited to become more ambitious. And there were also few specific targets regarding the tripling of renewables, renewable energy, wind, solar, and the doubling of energy efficiency. With that, I mean, certainly in other parts of the world, more insulation in houses, so that the warming of the houses, triple glazing, you name it. Quite sure what you would do here in terms of the air conditioning. but there are things that one can do, and the efforts have to be doubled there. The COP that took place just a few months ago, 2 months ago, November 2024, was a bit of disappointment in most respects, except for one. And even then, it did not go as far as it should have gone, but it was an improvement. What was agreed was financial assistance for developing countries, and that was a long outstanding issue where there was a debate on how much, and there used to be a promise to make available $100 billion a year to developing countries in order to address the climate crisis. That has now gone up to 300 billion after some nights of negotiations. But and be careful, not next year, not the year after. It's by 2035 that there will be that will be annually available. Remember some of the other targets, and many of these things have to be reached in 2030 already. And so this is all right, but 2035, 300 billion. This is by far not enough. Even conservative estimates say that developing countries will probably need anything in the region of 1.3 trillion dollars a year. What was done in Baku was then to agree on efforts to scale up financing to developing countries from public and private sources. That's where the hope is now going, private sources to reach that 1.3 trillion dollars a year by 2035. That was the only positive thing that came out of that. For the rest, but even that positive thing was limited. And then we have, well, yes, there was an agreement on carbon credit trading, but yeah. The next COP, and now we'll get a 5 minutes break. The next COP is planned for November 2025. Big issue on agenda will be the nationally determined contributions, because they have to be renegotiated, re-agreed, or re-announced. It's not a question of agreeing, re-announced. All countries are supposed to, in 2025, so this year, are supposed to say, well, we're going to do this and that, and that will be the big issue for the next COP. As you will see, we definitely need higher nationally determined contributions, because otherwise, no way get where we want to go. Where do we want to go? Well, to keep global warming at a level below 1.5 degrees Celsius. With that, we'll go for the break. I'll keep this during the break so that you can be as, yes, it's actually not fun. 5 minutes break.